Hi, everyone. This is Mr. P here with lesson number 15 on the campaign in Selma for voting rights. And you should check out the Freedom Summer campaign from our last video if you hadn't already, which also deals with voting rights and political power. So as always, there's a narrative linked here and the Eyes on the Prize episode that you can check out. I think the Selma one is particularly compelling. All right, so I'm going to disappear and we'll go to the full screen for this. There's a summary of the campaign here, a breakdown of how we analyze campaigns by conditions, demands, leaders, methods, the opponent response, and the degree of success. However, I think Selma is best told as a full narrative, so that's how I'm going to kind of approach it here. So it's important to recognize that there were many early efforts in Dallas County, where Selma is, in Alabama. Not Dallas, Texas. There were many early efforts to register Black voters since the 1930s, really. For 2 years, so the local organization was the Dallas County Voters League. Within the last 2 years prior to the Selma campaign of 1965, which is featured in Ava DuVernay's movie Selma, you can check that out. SNCC had been working to register voters prior to Dr. King's arrival. For 2 years, they had been doing this. For example, in Freedom Day in October of '63, there was a mass effort to get folks to register to vote. What was the stumbling block that they faced at the time? Well, only 1% of Black folks in Dallas County were registered prior to the 1965 campaign. And they only had, and I have this information here, they only had 2 days a week where the voter registration office was open, and they only processed 15 registrations per day. So slow progress was made. I love these photos because they show the attention the Selma campaign got. Howard Zinn is photographed here. James Baldwin is photographed here. So there were a lot of folks and allies who came to support the campaign. So on January 2nd, Southern Christian Leadership Conference begin their campaign with a mass meeting that defies Judge Hare's ban on mass meetings. Why did SCLC come? Well, local leader Emilio Boynton and ended up inviting SCLC and Dr. King, hoping to publicize on a stronger national scale the issue. Now, there was always a debate between local leaders throughout the civil rights movement whether to invite King or not. Oftentimes, local leaders wanted to invite him to bring out national attention, but some local leaders felt as though they struggled more once he left to actually get people locally to participate. Folks sometimes felt like, oh, King came and did his thing, and now we're done. And so there was a divide there. I'd say that depending on the local situation, impact varied. But that was a divide over the kind of King effect, so to speak. The other important piece here is that we see early on that there's a public safety director who wanted to avoid arrest and violence, but this guy, Police Chief Jim Clark, wanted to use armed force to repress the campaign. So within the opponent, there is a divide over how to respond to the campaign. In January, there was a series of marches to the Selma courthouse that sought mass arrest. This was seeking imprisonment. By February 5th, over 3,000 were arrested. Early on, public safety director was able to prevent some early arrests, but eventually arresting increased. There's lots of marches here. One that I wanted to highlight was the local teachers who led a march to the courthouse, which inspired a series of other groups leading marches, like the beauticians, a student strike in which 500 students were arrested. So it's important to kind of recognize the role that teachers played here in inspiring further participation and resistance. Throughout February, Sheriff Clark decided, okay, let's stop doing some of these arrests. But on February 10th, the police ended up chasing and beating students away from the courthouse. This led to the paradox of repression, and on February 15th, they had the longest line of demonstrators at the courthouse yet. These are actually images from March. I don't have images from the February actions that I'm describing here. So by February 18th, SCLC wanted to escalate the actions. They felt able to do that now that more people were participating, so they decided to hold a night march to escalate the campaign. During this night march, troopers murdered civil rights activist Jimmy Jackson, who was trying to protect his mother from a police brutality at the time. He ended up dying about 8 days later. This led the campaign to end up planning a march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. And so his funeral is featured here. This got some local attention, but not a lot of national attention. So Jimmy Jackson was the first person to die in the Selma campaign, to be killed in the Selma campaign. So by March 7th, Hosea Williams of SCLC, King was not here. He was away in Atlanta, I believe, and he leads a march. John Lewis of SNCC participated, although SNCC did not participate as an organization. They opposed this strategy. And this is known as Bloody Sunday because they ended up facing the police. This is photographed by 25-year-old photographer James Spider Martin, who becomes quite famous because of these Selma photographs. And this results in what's known as Bloody Sunday. John Lewis' skull is fractured. He's currently a congressman. Actually, recently I was able to visit over the summer his office, which is in DC, which is basically a museum. It's quite incredible. Anyone can go there and visit his office. It's history of the civil rights movement in that office in terms of photographs and objects is quite incredible. But he ends up suffering from mass beatings, and many others do. Here, this gets publicized and leads to more people joining the march. Ended up lots of white ministers, about 450 white clergymen and nuns and folks end up joining the Turnaround Tuesday march. This becomes Turnaround Tuesday because SNCC calls it that, because during the march, King decides not to confront the police and they turn around. They don't continue with the march over Edmund Pettus Bridge. This is due to a court order that told them not to march, and King had agreed not to do this. He was criticized heavily by SNCC for this. Later that night, James Reeb, one of the ministers, white clergymen who had arrived for him, it was from Boston, was beaten and killed. The three men who did this murder were acquitted, and they admitted to committing the murder later, but they were acquitted. And it's important here to mention a few things. One, there's a link here to learn more about his particular murder and the myths that surround his murder. During the trial, there was this mythology that it wasn't the beatings that killed him. It was the civil rights movement that tried to make him into a martyr by preventing him from accessing health services. And there's a whole roundabout way that they go about making that argument. It's not true. It's a lie, but people still believe it today. You can check out this really interactive site here. And there is a critique to be had here that his murder got more attention than Jimmy Jackson's, which I talked about earlier, because he was white. So he got more national attention. The outrage among white society and the government was higher. Lyndon B. Johnson actually mentioned him when he introduced the Voting Rights Act in the middle of this campaign. After Turnaround Tuesday, SNCC ends up splitting off and doing their own demonstrations, frustrated with King's decision not to continue with the march. So SNCC organizes students to hold their own marches and demonstrations. By March 21st, SCLC and King lead a march from Selma to Montgomery. This is a 5-day, very long march from Selma to the Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. And they arrive in Montgomery. They're welcomed. They arrive and they're welcomed by folks in this town, in the city. And after the march, Viola Liuzzo, a white civil rights activist, was murdered. And so we ended up with 3 people killed as a result of violent repression of the campaign and of the movement. I just love these photos of the 50th anniversary. Here's John Lewis, who skull was fractured during this. President Obama. Amelia Boynton is here, and she was the local leader who ended up inviting King. And so she's featured here during the 50th anniversary in 2015. So now we'll move into the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act here ended up getting signed into law. So the campaign is, considered quite successful. No voting qualifications or prerequisites were to be applied by any state due to color or race. And not only that, but the Attorney General could appoint federal examiners to make sure that to oversee kind of how the courts were handling 15th Amendment lawsuits, and states and any subdivision like a township had previously racially discriminatory policies like literacy tests. They had to get pre-clearance for any changes in laws around voter qualification. And that's really important here. So what difference did this make? It led to a significant increase in the registration of Black voters. You can see here before the act and after, Mississippi goes from 6% to 60%. It's one of the Deep South states that has the highest percentage of Black voters by 1967. You can credit the Freedom Summer campaign, actually, right? Because they did a lot of that groundwork there to get people ready. So once the laws changed, they were able to register at a high rate. So these increases in registration were significant and led to an increase in Black people getting elected into office throughout the South. You can see that this peak here is during the Reconstruction era, and then significant drops during the Jim Crow era, and then it picks up again here. The blue line goes from 1960 to 1992. If this was straight on, it would be over here, right here. So it picks up again, and this blue line takes us up by 1992. It's almost back in the South at levels that it was at during Reconstruction era. So you can see how long it took, right? The Voting Rights Act is right around here. So this increase happens as a result of the Voting Rights Act. That's crucial. The piece about pre-clearance is really crucial here too. You can see that all the red, the blue, and the purple are townships that previously had vote literacy tests and racially discriminatory policies that needed to get federal government Justice Department to clear them on any changes in their laws. But that is no longer applies since the 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision. So for the last 7 years, they do not need to get pre-clearance anymore. So the Voting Rights Act was successfully gutted by folks who were pushing to increase voter suppression strategies. So that led to a number of voting restriction laws, voter ID laws, nothing that was explicitly racially discriminatory, but does disproportionately impact Black folks, folks of color, immigrants, poor people in particular. So there has been an increasing in voter restrictions, such as the photo ID laws that require like a photo ID to be able to vote, those types of things. I guess I'll mention very briefly that the VRA contributed, the Voting Rights Act contributed to white voters moving from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It's important to mention that it did not begin that process. White voters had started to do that earlier. Black voters had been starting to move to the Democratic Party since the since Republican Party abandoned them in Reconstruction, but particularly since the New Deal and FDR, even though it didn't didn't do I would say a fantastic job of supporting like agricultural and domestic workers initially, where most Black folks were like 60-70% of Black folks were employed. Nevertheless, this shift in alignment around race in the parties was exacerbated by the Voting Rights Act, but it took time to happen. You can see by 2002, these counties that originally had been strong Democratic strongholds become Republican. And so there's a real realignment around race in the parties. So the next video is going to be on the Chicago Freedom Movement. I hope you tune back in to check that one out. Take care of yourselves. Bye. Ciao.